And welcome into the Fantasy Points live stream. I'm your host, Nick Skrip, and we have a great one for you guys today. As always, I'm here with Scott Barrett. Scott, how was the fourth weekend?
It was good. Saw some fireworks. Just did the token 4th of July thing.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier it was like a back-to-back day. I had my daughter's birthday party straight into the 4th, so it was a bit of a long weekend, but just back into the actual swing of things here. But should have a great show for you guys here today. We have an awesome guest with us who is below us.
You say that every time.
That's true. That's true. I try to give everybody some good credit though. But JJ Zachariason, JJ Late Round Fantasy Football website. On that website, you can find your Patreon guides, the newsletter, links to the podcast itself, which we're going to talk about today, the Late Round Fantasy Football podcast. You also have the Living the Stream, and you just released, which we'll talk about as well, a major guy that is awesome. But JJ, thank you for joining the podcast today. How are things going?
Things are great, man. Things are great. I'm glad to be past the 4th. I'm not the biggest fireworks guy in the world, but now I have a kid. Like, you gotta kind of like them. You just kind of have to deal with it. But glad that we're past it. I feel like now we're finally like people are like finally getting into fantasy football and they're like really ready for the season. I'm pumped for it.
Yeah, I think as soon as July 1st hits, it's like that switch that we're getting closer to redraft season. Everybody's starting to look a little bit more, especially the guys that are not as degenerate as the rest of us here. But before we get into things, Scott, you mentioned before this OG article. I wanted to ask about that because it has to do with JJ. I'm not too familiar with it, but it sounds like something that we need to bring up here. But it has to do with the legendary Frank Gore, which I think last time I checked, he was boxing or something like that, but he played in the NFL for about 30-ish years. But can you talk about that? I'm curious.
Yeah, before we get in, JJ, we need to talk about your coaching tree. Like, Andy Reid's coaching tree is legendary. JJ has a legendary tree. He spawned so many of the best fantasy analysts out there. Myself, Graham Barfield, Chris Raybon, I think Rich Rebar. Who else is on there, JJ?
Justin Freeman was one that was there. I know I'm going to Brian Jester, who went on and is crushing the DFS scene now. There's a lot of people. Obviously people who are still at Number Fire, Brandon Gadula and Jim Sanas, who do awesome work. It's been cool to see all that sort of like, makes me sound like I'm like this like 55-year-old like fantasy analyst that has been around for a super. I've been around for a while, but not that old, I promise.
Yeah, so I got my start at Number Fire with JJ. I started as a baseball writer. My first ever article was about Masahiro Tanaka coming over to the majors. And I did a deep dive into his stats in whatever country he's from and how that translates. And I wrote a bunch. My second article was about why Archie Vaughn was the greatest shortstop of all time ahead of Derek Jeter, and just like a bunch of weird pieces like that. And I just really wasn't great. Like early on, maybe by my 5th article, I was like, no, I'm going to do this for a living. I'm going to be a professional fantasy analyst. I feel it in my bones. I had no reason to think that. I was, again, really painfully mediocre. No one read my articles except for JJ, who spent hours hand holding me, walking me through the editorial process. Here's what's wrong. Here's you need to fix. And I had a number of pieces I would submit, and it just wasn't up to JJ's standards, and he got rejected. And I didn't get paid anything for it. JJ wasn't happy about that. He always pushed to get the writers paid, but it was sort of out of his control until maybe a year or two, or maybe like right after I left. I think
probably right after you left. Yeah, it was a start. Yeah. It was the startup life, and like I had only so much say, and like this is the way things kind of like were back then too. But yeah, it was a kind of crappy situation from my perspective, because obviously I'm a writer and content creator myself, and I know that's important.
Yeah, I think I was paid so handsomely, far more than I was worth, because again, my articles were garbage, but JJ really took the time to hold my hand and to help me become a better analyst and writer. And so it was just absolutely crucial to my success within the industry. And I really do owe so much of what I've accomplished, maybe all of it, to JJ, because without him, I'm not sure. I probably wouldn't be here. So huge props to JJ for that. Thank you, man.
Well, but too much credit, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, but so I don't know how it is for like most people. Like when you talk about like getting good at something, it's like incremental progress where you get 1% better each day. Like for me, that's just not the case. Whether it's playing sports or competitive gaming or writing or whatever, like I just start off at like this level and then I just stay there for a really long time, and then just like one day I just go up to here where it's like, like I'm a soccer player, I'm like the worst guy on the team for 3 years. And then one practice, I just like wake up and I start playing and I'm like the third best guy, I'm the second best guy, I'm the best guy. And that's exactly how it was, as JJ knows, with this infamous piece where like I was probably one of the, like one of his least favorite people, or just another article I got to spend hours editing from Scott. But not this time. I wrote an article on why it was maybe my third ever football article. My first one was like 5,000 words and why LeGarrette Blount was the RB to own in New England's backfield.
Yeah.
But this one was why Frank Gore was undervalued in best ball leagues. And I just like felt like it felt good off the bat. And JJ like emailed, he was like, "Oh my God, dude, you get it now. You get it. This is like a perfect piece. You crushed it." And it was just smooth sailing from there. It was all downhill. And my only concern is now that Frank Gore is retired, like, do I lose some magic? Is this like is the magic gone? Did I lose all my talent? So I don't know. But any memories from back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, look, back then it was literally me editing everything that was going in and out of Number Fire. There's a big team there now, and I'm not there anymore, but there's a great team that's there right now and handling a lot of that stuff. But yeah, back then it was me, just like I had a certain standard that I appreciated and wanted like on the site, and I was gonna work with whoever was willing to work on their content. It wasn't really a situation where like. I don't think it ever like got to a point of like the people I was talking to like were mad at me or anything. It was more so just that I was, trying to find people like Scott who were willing to just like work on what they were doing, work on their craft a little bit. And as we worked together on it, and, I saw a lot of people leave and go and do bigger and better things. And it sucked from my perspective because I lost good writers and stuff, but I couldn't do anything about it because we were a startup at the time. And then, later on we were able to retain a ton of people, which was great. But, there's some of those OGs like Scott and Graham and Raybon and stuff where I look back and I'm like, man, we could have had this dream team if we were able to pay everyone. Yeah.
That's super interesting. And Scott, I know, even now, I think Joe's editing your articles, and you at the beginning of some of them have to apologize just because some of the massive pieces like following the draft. I think the wide receiver guide, I think the first like paragraph, you're like, I had to give my editor a heads up of how this piece was going to go.
Yeah. I tend to overwrite stuff, but I definitely maintained JJ's attention to detail and perfectionism, definitely. Especially when I edit pieces like Jake Tribby's or Jeff Henderson's. And yeah, I just think with like my own stuff, like very few edits that Joe has to make, and really and at PFF too, like very few edits ever on my pieces. And a lot of that was because JJ took the time to teach me how to write. I wasn't a great writer in the beginning. So
speaking of pieces, obviously, JJ, you just released this late round draft guide. I want to talk about that, but not give away too much because I think it's 100% worth checking out. I know Scott and I have taken some time to look at it and go through it, and it is awesome to say the least. But within that, again, not giving away too much, but you have some fantasy topics, looking at regression, variance, rankings, with important quotes. I like that piece of it. Yeah, some good quotes of what you're trying to emphasize, and then good details kind of surrounding that. And then you go into some positional strategies and players to target, players to avoid, dart throws. You have a cheat sheet at the end. So it's a massive piece. It's well put together. Scott has mentioned a couple of times, loves the graphics of it, but I wanted to make sure you can take a little bit of time here just to talk about the benefits of just the average fantasy manager to invest in the guide and what makes it different, because we see a ton of guides out in the space, but from myself just speaking, just checking this out, it is extremely different than what I've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, nothing against anyone who's ever like created a guide or puts guides out there. There's a lot of good stuff out there. I just really approach my content usually, I try to double down on like what I know I'm good at doing first off. And usually that's looking at the strategy side of redraft and digging into some concepts that others might not be digging into necessarily, and asking questions and trying to answer questions that others might not be asking and answering. And so, instead of approaching this draft guide from the perspective of like, here are my top 200 guys, I'm going to profile each of these players, and you're going to know generally who I like and who I don't like. My whole approach to fantasy football and as an analyst is to teach people to fish, not just give them the fish and give them these answers. It's important to me, to allow people to see that higher level and have a good understanding of the game itself and the game theory components of fantasy football, because that's what's fun about the game. That's why we love it, and that's why we talk about it, right? Because we see these like really small details where we can find edges. And when we find those edges, it's so much fun, right? And I want to share that with other people and make them realize and see and have them see that they can do that themselves. They don't need to necessarily, just listen to an analyst that's just saying, draft this guy, avoid this guy, avoid this guy. I have that in the guide, it's there, but the foundation is what's more important. And that foundation is strategy. And so, the whole guide is really me just digging through strategy that's pretty evergreen in nature, to be honest. But I do sort of morph it to speak to the 2022 season in particular, just using data and kind of going through historical ADP trends and such.
Yeah, you just spoke to, these small edges that we could find and then maximize. And that's, in every single game, it's in poker. The best players are aware of all the smallest edges and combining those to have a compounding effect to lead you to victory. And you made me think of one edge that like everyone is aware of and no one's exploiting it again. I think it was at Number Fire, Rich Rebar's landmark piece on the Konami code quarterback and how hypermobile quarterbacks are such a cheat code in fantasy, regardless of how talented they are as a passer. Tim Tebow, the perfect example. And one of my all-time calls was Lamar Jackson in his sophomore season. I had 90% exposure. Jalen Hurts last year in his sophomore season, I had 90% exposure. And now we're seeing Trey Lance and Justin Fields being drafted as high-end QB2s. And from what I remember in your draft guide, you highlighted both of those quarterbacks as top values, and I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, the thing that's really interesting about the quarterback position is that if you look at like a typical VORP formula or like some way of looking at, best starter versus worst starter, however you want to really look at it, the edge that you're finding at the quarterback position isn't necessarily more significant than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago when looking at postseason result, right? So where a guy finished, the QB1, the QB2 versus the QB11, QB12, that edge really actually was pretty small last year, all things considered on a points per game basis. But the difference is that because of this Konami code, because of rushing, because of the mobility aspect of these quarterbacks, what's happening is that they're becoming a lot more predictable, right? And the market is finally catching up and realizing that mobile quarterbacks are better in fantasy football, so they're drafting them higher. And the example that I kind of shared in the guide that I think is really relevant and like should hopefully let people kind of see why mobility matters so much in terms of predictability is if you had Jalen Hurts versus Tom Brady, and I were to tell you, okay, of these two guys, who's gonna throw more touchdowns this year? I think we'd all probably say the greatest quarterback of all time would be throwing more touchdowns this year. But there's a chance, there's non-zero chance that Jalen Hurts could throw more touchdowns than Tom Brady this year. Like it's a possibility. We understand that touchdown variance is real, that touchdown rate fluctuates, all of that kind of stuff. But if I were to sit here and say who's going to have more rushing yards this year, Jalen Hurts, or rushing touchdowns even, but Jalen Hurts or Tom Brady, and everyone would sit there and say, there's no way that Tom Brady's ever going to have better rushing production than Jalen Hurts is. And if you break up quarterback scoring from a passing standpoint and a rushing standpoint, quarterback rushing in terms of fantasy points per game, rushing fantasy points per game, so much more stable year over year because we're seeing the same quarterbacks run the ball year over year. So that's contributing to this really, really strong correlation when looking at preseason expectation and ADP versus postseason results. So what's really happening at the quarterback position right now, it's not that Josh Allen and these guys are necessarily giving you this big edge in points per game. It's that it's more predictable now. Like now we can feel very good about a Josh Allen, about a Lamar Jackson, all those guys really finishing as a top 6, top 7 quarterback. Whereas back in 2015, there were 2 years, 2015 and 2018. If you looked at preseason top 18 quarterbacks by ADP and you looked at their correlation between preseason ADP to their points per game, the correlation was 0, meaning the QB 17, the QB 18 was just as good essentially as a QB 2, QB 3 because it was just throwing darts among those players. Now that correlation is very, very strong. So really, if you're drafting quarterbacks early these days, it's because you want that predictability, you want that stability. But there are still some guys that are slipping through the cracks, and I think 2 of those guys, as Scott alluded to, are Trey Lance and Justin Fields.
So is late round QB dead, JJ? Like, what are your?
So yeah, you know what's pseudo annoying about like the fact that I'm so tied to this strategy is that 3 years ago when a lot of this shift started happening, I wrote about it. Like I talked about it, how the market was becoming more efficient with mobile quarterbacks, and as a result, we're going to see a lot more efficiency, and we might see a little bit more difficulty in terms of finding these quarterbacks late that have this dual threat ability. And we started to see that. I mean, there's not as many, but what we are finding, I will say this too, what we are finding is that the QBs that are ranked in that like QB 10, QB 12 range over the last couple of years, they've been really, really good values. I mean, we had that with Josh Allen a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. Last year, we had that with Tom Brady. We had that with Aaron Rodgers a couple of years ago as well. I mean, Aaron Rodgers kind of the last 2, but a couple of years ago, Aaron Rodgers was there. And that's the sweet spot, I think, right now, because you're sort of towing that line of like, you don't have to go all in on early round quarterback, but at the same time, you're recognizing that the stability piece is important. And all the while, these QB 9 to QB 12s are still giving you pretty good value. And that I think is continuing to be the sweet spot this year. Just get the guy who falls out of that group, that top 12, top 12-ish group. Get the guy who falls into that range, and you should be good. Whether that's like Russ, Russell Wilson obviously has some upside this year, whether that is Trey Lance. I mean, the Trey Lance is like the easy go-to because that's where his ADP is. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at with things. And what's crazy too, is that when I published the late round quarterback ebook back in 2012, that was what I considered a late round quarterback, was just be like the last dude to draft your quarterback, the last hypothetical starter, because you're not getting that much of an edge by getting the guy early. And I feel the same way now. Get that QB 9 to QB 12 guy.
And that was a great time to do it too. Again, with fantasy football, ADP always fluctuates. What's optimal in 1 year is going to be different from what's optimal in another year. But I remember at your peak of, whenever you released the late round QB PDF outlining the strategy, I was in a Football Guys Players Championship draft, and one team literally didn't draft his quarterback until the last round. And he ended up either winning that league or losing to me in the championship. So, and he took Joe Flacco, your doppelganger.
Oh man.
But I just wanted to give a quick plug to Jeff Henderson, one of our writers, who's one of the best data guys, one of the best like meta strategy writers in the space. He wrote an article, "Is Josh Allen worth a first round pick?" And by his numbers, he is. And he makes an extremely compelling case for him. And he said his backup plan is Justin Herbert round 3 or 4, because Herbert, Allen, Mahomes, whoever QB4 is to him, they all should go in round 2, but they're not. Like, this is now where the value is. And I'm sympathetic to it. Again, he makes a really compelling case, but I just can't stop. Like, my strategy was always the JJ Zachariason strategy. Let me get like the cheapest QB12, because the first 11 go off the board, and then there's a lull because no one wants to draft their backup before like a running back or wide receiver. So you get like a good discount on the QB12 or QB13. And I'm just looking at ADP again, and it's like Dak Prescott QB11, Matthew Stafford QB12, Trey Lance QB13, Tom Brady just short of that. And then a backup plan would be Deshaun Watson or Justin Fields as late as QB20.
Yeah. The other point that I made in the guide, and another reason why I think going after that like 9 to 13, whatever range, the low end QB1s, is, we're seeing that consistency. Like I said, when you look at top 18 quarterbacks by ADP and how they finished in points per game, if you want to look at the R squared, I have the R squareds in the guide as well. the R squared in like I said, in 2015 and 2018 was literally 0. I mean, it was nothing. It was irrelevant. Like, it didn't matter where you drafted your quarterbacks. The last 2 years, it's jumped so dramatic. It's been 55% the last 2 years.
So I saw that in your draft guide, and I was like, I don't think that's correct, because the last time I ran it 2 years ago, quarterback had the worst correlation to ADP. But yeah, and maybe it's just, now the production's far more predictable.
Exactly. So like you saw, like, part of the reason why, for instance, you draft an early round tight end, or you can, and it's more it's easier to do that from a strategy standpoint, is because there's more consistency from those guys in terms of how we're predicting them, entering the season. We know that Travis Kelce is probably going to be pretty good. We know that, that Mark Andrews is probably going to be pretty good, whatever. But at quarterback, it's just been such a crapshoot. But over the last 2 years, it's been so consistent. The top quarterbacks have been so good. And you could sit there and say, oh, that means that getting Josh Allen is really safe, which, yes, it is going to be really safe. But I do fear that there's going to be some regression with that stability eventually, right? And whether that hits this year, whether that hits next year, I mean, we're going to get to a point where there are a lot more dual threat quarterbacks that are entering the league that are good. Like, what happens if both Trey Lance and Justin Fields both hit from a fantasy perspective and they're long-term starters? Now you're going to have like 9 or 10 legit dual threat quarterback. Why would you draft one early in that case? Because you're going to have a guy that you can easily get that has literally QB1 upside that you're getting that late. So I do think that there's going to be some regression there. Maybe that doesn't hit this year, very easily could not, but that's why going in that like QB9 to QB12 range makes sense, because you're kind of playing both sides there. You're playing the side of like, yes, those guys have been really good the last couple of years. But also, if there is regression from that really reliability and predictability standpoint, then you're still good, because you're getting a player that's not in the early rounds.
Yeah, so tons of positional and other strategies, which I feel like doesn't get talked about enough when just looking at content. It's very player focused versus like actually playing the game and having these strategies for drafting and how to view and separate players. So I think that's one of the more standout things about the guide, outside of obviously some great player talk too. So if you guys have not checked it out, it's in the comment section there on the website. JJ, I want to talk about some topics from your podcast. I joked with my wife, and then it wasn't much of a joke, but I was just like on the highway for a week, just taking down notes, audio notes on my phone from the podcast. So I got yelled at about that, but more player specific questions that I kind of came up with, and Scott as well. But before we jump into that, big news today: Baker Mayfield is going to be a Seattle Seahawk. And as soon as we get the Shefty tweet, or one of the for the I'm sorry, the Panthers. I'm mixing things up. The Panthers. Sorry about that. But as soon as we get the news, everybody's mind goes straight to the phone and breaks down how that affects every person in the system. We got guys that are ranking DJ Moore as a top 5 wide receiver. We have guys that say it doesn't affect DJ Moore as much as we think. People are looking at Christian McCaffrey and just down the list. So I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are, how Baker Mayfield's presence affects the rest of the guys within the system for fantasy. You guys can just jump in as you want here.
Yeah, I mean, I can kick things off. I mean, I think it's an upgrade, at the position. The thing with DJ Moore is obviously, he hasn't gotten a lot of red zone looks over basically his career. And a lot of that is not necessarily like red zone share, but more so that they just haven't had sustained drives, and they haven't been in the red zone a lot because the offense hasn't been as good. And so hopefully, they're a little bit more efficient offensively with a better quarterback. But I if you look at like the top 12 wide receivers in fantasy, top 12, 13-ish, what have you, it's just really hard to for me to squeeze in DJ Moore, into there. I updated my projections when it all happened. And obviously Carolina got a little bump from a pure touchdown standpoint, overall touchdown standpoint, with the move to Baker, but DJ Moore was still wide receiver 15 in my projections on a points per game basis. So it's not like he's this like full blown stud wide receiver 1. And a lot of times, again, you got to keep in mind too, with projections, they kind of favor guys like DJ Moore. They kind of favor guys like Keenan Allen, because it's not going to recognize these like outlier touchdown seasons that inevitably some higher end wide receiver 1 is going to hit, like Mike Evans had last year and maybe even have this year. And so, it won't recognize that as well in a projection. So, take that with a grain of salt. I think DJ Moore is still more of a high end wide receiver 2, mid-range wide receiver 2, like in that like McLaurin, Jalen Waddle tier, kind of had him or like close to there already. So I'm not really moving him dramatically up. I think it's a little bit of a bump, but I don't want to overdo it.
Yeah, so he's a tricky one for me. We were just debating this when it came time to update projections based on this news, and ultimately we moved him up to wide receiver 11. But like my personal stance is I'm agnostic, and I'm going to basically value him the same as ADP. He's tricky because everyone's like, oh, well, he's so good and he just needed a more competent quarterback, and now he has a competent quarterback. But I also think sometimes we tend to overvalue these players where it's like, oh, he's so good. He just needs a quarterback when sometimes like that quarterback uncertainty and just the raw volume of minimal competition for targets could be making him look better than he is. Maybe he's just like mid, and yeah, he had bad quarterback play, but still just like mid. Yes, a positive touchdown regression. Yes, he's probably really good. But I mean, he hasn't finished top 25 in fantasy points per game in either of the last 2 seasons. 2 seasons ago with Teddy Bridgewater, Curtis Samuel and Robbie Anderson both scored more fantasy points. And so he's just someone that there's a lot of uncertainty here, and it's like a big question mark to me. And like, I don't really, like to take players that are this uncertain to me. I like to gamble on knowns where it's like, okay, James Conner's ADP is garbage, I'm fading him. Adam Thielen's ADP is amazing, I'm going to draft him everywhere. Where DJ Moore, it's like, yeah, maybe he's really good. I don't know. He just hasn't proven enough to me. So I'm probably just going to rank him just about perfectly in line with ADP.
Would you say the same about guys like Robbie Anderson or Terrace Marshall, or there's been a little bit of camp talk about guys like Tommy Tremble that have been coming out? Is everybody still around the same range? Like I'm looking at Robbie Anderson, ADPs around wide receiver 74. Like, I mean, I don't know if that.
Well, part of it is, he had great volume last year, but Christian McCaffrey's coming back. Yeah. And Matt Rule's an absolute donkey who fired Joe Brady because he wants to run the ball 30 times per game. So I have serious question marks. Like sure Baker's there now and things look better, but like things didn't look good before that happened, and they don't look too much better now. So all of those are concerns. I think Terrace Marshall's like vaguely intriguing as a last round pick in a best ball tournament. I think the masses have finally woken up to rookie wide receivers being undervalued, but I think sophomore wide receivers are still undervalued. We saw like DJ Chark's sophomore season coming out of nowhere, him being a massive league winner. And I think that could be in Marshall's range of outcomes or Amari Rogers' range of outcomes. The problem with Marshall is like my model didn't really love him. He's a freak athlete, but otherwise not super impressive. But you might have. Did you like him, JJ?
I liked him subjectively. It was my biggest like mistake that I made last year. Is my model didn't like him nearly as much as some of the other guys, and I'm like, no, this guy's going to be good. I know he's going to. And then I subjectively shifted him up and had him. I mean, I still had him in the same tier that like everyone had him in and stuff. It wasn't like some insane, like I didn't have him over like some of the studs, but like over Waddle or anything like that. But I mean, realistically though, like we know based on history that guys who are as inefficient as him and as unproductive as him as rookies, the chance, I mean, like you said, he's a last round pick, so whatever, but like we know that the chance of him doing something is still very, very slim.
I want to give him just a little credit because he's such a freak athlete that, maybe steep learning curve, but then, lives up to his athletic potential. But no, I think that's absolutely right. And the guy I did that with this year was Dameon Pierce. My model hated, and I just made this bull case argument. I fell in love with it, but I might get bailed out just because it was the perfect landing spot. But no, I mean, I get that.
Yeah. So with the late round fantasy football podcast, what I like about that as well is it's like 20 minutes or less than 20 minutes, very to the point. I feel like the very casual fantasy manager can listen to it, fully understand. I feel like somebody who's a diehard can listen to it and gain something from it. So one of the recent episodes, team level regression, you talked about how team level regression typically, trickles down to players. You talked about the Eagles, Giants, Ravens, and Bucs. So I kind of wanted to dive into some questions about those teams here. Starting with Scott's Giants, you talked about they struggled with the touchdowns last season. That was a massive factor, but looking at this season now, new head coach, O-line improvements, hopefully healthy, better schedule this year. So I did want to
Pace
ask,
of play.
what's that?
Pace of play. They're going to
Pace
pick
of
up
play,
their pace
yep.
of play.
So I did want to ask like player specifics, because I feel like if you look at the current ADPs of, you go down the list of Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley, Tony, Wan'Dale Robinson, you just go down the list and you can say, hey, these guys might be a bit of a value right now where they're going right now. But I wanted to ask specifically, who should we be? I know you mention often, JJ, Kadarius Toney. Is that the guy that stands out the most to you as somebody that can be impacted for fantasy for these factors?
Yeah, I mean, look, like I don't think people realize how bad the Giants' offense has been the last 2 years. Like I'm talking like second to tied for last in the league in touchdowns 2 years ago, last in the league in touchdowns last year. I mean, it's been a very, very bad offense, and so to me, we see natural regression every single year with offenses that are that bad. They usually score more touchdowns the following year. A lot of that has to do with the fact that teams score poorly one season. Because a lot went wrong with like the quarterback position, whatever, or things just went bad and they switch things up, like we're seeing with the Giants with the hiring of Brian Dable. They switch things up and they just get better. So naturally, there's these fluctuations year over year, and so we're going to see that. I mean, if you look at how teams that have scored as poorly as they have and how they've done the following season, if you just average that out, we're looking at like probably potentially 14 more touchdowns for the Giants this year, which is a huge, huge jump just based on where they were, and so. A lot of people, as we know, will draft based on last year's numbers and such, and that's why ADP is reflected that way. I think the entire Giants offense is a value right now. I mean, Saquon right now, I've been gobbling him up, and I mean, especially when he was in the third often, which was insane. But so, Saquon obviously gets a huge bump. With Brian Dable there, I think they're going to be more pass heavy. As we know, targets are a lot more valuable than rush attempts are. It's a great thing for a guy like Saquon who could capture 15 to 18% of the team's targets pretty easily in this offense. Kadarius Toney is one of my highest rostered players right now in best ball. We've seen his ceiling already. We saw that last year, especially that Dallas game. Really, really good on a per route basis last year at a really high targets per route run rate. Really elite, I should say. It wasn't just like really good. It was like top 5 in the league. And so, we saw that ceiling hit. If you're getting him past wide receiver 40, that's a value. Just because we know the ceiling is there and we should be chasing ceiling at all parts of our draft, especially at that point in the draft. And then Daniel Jones, to me is someone who, you don't need to rely on him in a single quarterback league as your QB1. There's no reason to really do that. But if you're in a super flex league or if you're in a deep league and you need like some QB2, QB3 type depth, I mean, he had 3 fewer rushing yards per game than Kyler Murray last year. He threw 10 touchdowns in 11 games, and he averaged just as many fantasy points per game as Derek Carr did last year. And if we look at what Brian Dable was able to do with Josh Allen, I'm not saying Daniel Jones is anything like Josh Allen, or we should expect that kind of jump because Josh Allen made the biggest jump that we've ever seen in NFL history at the quarterback position from one year to the next. But the one trait that they share is this mobility and this sort of like just kind of loose cannon attitude in the pocket. And if Brian Dable sort of allows Daniel Jones to just run wild, we could see that really be reflected in fantasy points per game. So I'm into Daniel Jones as sort of like a QB3 kind of dart, especially in super flex. But even if you want just a backup quarterback in a deeper format, I'm cool with that too.
Scott, same sort of question, obviously with your Giants. Who stands out? I know they all seem like JJ seem to be a value right now, but do you find yourself maybe drafting or looking at one specific guy in best ball more than the rest of the group?
Yeah, so this is probably my favorite team stack for underdog tournament leagues. I talk about an anatomy of a league winner where I just look back at all of the top league winning players over the past 4 seasons. And at every single position, again and again, you see people underrating offensive play caller changes, especially when the offensive play caller has a proven track record of success. Per sources on Brian Dable, what I heard like 2 years ago was like widely respected as like one of the greatest minds in football, but just like an absolute weirdo. So no one wanted to make him a head coach. But yeah, proven track record of at least fantasy success. And he's going to increase the pace of play. That's not unsubstantial. Then, the Giants, they did a QB sneak on 3rd and 9. We're just like forfeiting games. Like they're at least going to like try this year. The Giants have a massively upgraded supporting cast in terms of receivers, finally healthy. Receivers always either bad and or hurt throughout the Daniel Jones tenure. Offensive line, and then coaches is really huge. Jones himself for best ball has some of the highest percentage of spike weeks of any quarterback. Again, they have the best quarterback schedule, the second best wide receiver schedule. Saquon Barkley, I'm in love with because we know his upside. I chase upside. And when do you want to target oft injured running backs? It's the year following the ACL injury. I made a mistake drafting him last year. I didn't listen to Dr. Chow's advice, and this is what you do. And I feel really good about him as an upside wins championships pick. Kadarius Toney, ankle, hamstring, quad, oblique, thumb, shoulder, and knee injuries. But he ended the season ranking 12th in yards per route run. That's the 8th best mark by any rookie wide receiver over the past 10 seasons. As JJ alluded to with Terrace Marshall, that is the most predictive stat for measuring a wide receiver's future success following a rookie season. Just massive upside, and we saw that. We saw that in some of the few games he was totally healthy. You can make a case for Kenny Galladay just based on he finished 5th in total fantasy points in 2019 and then dealt with injuries, but I'm not going to target him. Sterling Shepard, I think he's dust following the torn Achilles. Daniel Bellinger's going undrafted, even though he's running with the ones. There's a case there, but I think I like Wan'Dale Robinson the most. Just a player my model absolutely loved. The NFL mock draft Cognizanti, didn't love that, but the model just really loved him. I think there's potential there, and to me, it's two things. Again, per sources, Kadarius Toney likes football about as much as I like macrame. He cares about football as much as I care about Tamagotchi or something. I don't know, which is not at all, which is a concern. And so they sort of just drafted this, paid high draft capital. They drafted him really high, and he's going 4 full rounds later than any rookie wide receiver being drafted ahead of him in underdog drafts. And it's this slot role. And so it just sort of looks like a knock on Kadarius just by drafting him. And it's a new regime that's invested in. This regime had nothing tied to Kadarius Toney. And so I see them having a plan in place for him. And again, this is the team I like more than any for game stacks in underdog. Next closest would be Arizona, or maybe some full YOLO Deshaun Watson teams, but that's it.
Another team mentioned same podcast episode was the Bucs, and this one really stuck out to me because I feel like you mentioned that we shouldn't fit in last year's or try to fit in this year's personnel in the last year's personnel, and I feel like that happens pretty often. We say that Tom Brady went and requested Russell Gage to be on the team. Now we got Gronk out of the mix, and we're thinking about the tight end position. Chris Godwin's timeline, we're not completely sure of. So I think that is important just to understand that it's two different offenses. It doesn't mean that they're going to be a team that maybe completely changes the way they play, but I feel like it may, just based off what you were saying about that, have an impact on Tom Brady. Obviously, he performed above expectations last year as a QB3, but JJ, how do you, from your points made on that show about not trying to fit this year's personnel in the last year's, how does that affect Tom Brady? Does it have a massive impact on his fantasy stock, or how do you view that?
Yeah, I mean, look, they threw the ball 731 times last year. They had one of the highest pass rates that we've seen over the last decade. Those numbers regress. Pass rate regresses year over year. It happens because either it's very difficult to sustain that high of a pass rate, either it could also be due to game script. It could be due to a lot of things. And when you combine that with all of the changes that have gone on with Tampa Bay this offseason, you have Gronk retiring, maybe he comes back halfway through the season, whatever. But you have Gronk retiring, so you have question marks at tight end. You have Cameron Brate, who's nothing special at the position, and then you have you have a rookie in Otten. I mean, there's not that much going on at the tight end position. Chris Godwin is likely not going to be back for a good while. I know your boy Edwin Podras is very bearish on his situation. And they replaced Antonio Brown really with Russell Gage. That's what it comes down to. And say what you want about AB. He's still was last year, still one of the best wide receivers in football when he was active. So there's a lot of change going on. And then on top of that, Bruce Arians isn't there anymore as on the coaching staff. And they've already talked about how they want to run the ball a little bit more than they did last year, just given philosophy. The one thing with quarterbacks in fantasy with these pocket passers, in order for them to have seasons like Tom Brady had last year, or even like a Stafford to some degree last year, you need some sort of like outlier season in some way, either in touchdown rate or just pure volume. We saw that with Tom Brady. He had a 6% touchdown rate, which was relatively high. He had good weapons, so we should have expected that to some degree. But they threw the ball 731 times. So I think when you're projecting this Tampa Bay offense, especially like for anyone who does like vacated targets and looks at things from that perspective, can't really do that well with a Tampa Bay offense whenever they're probably going to throw the ball like 80 fewer times this year than they did last year. And so it's just a really important context to have. So, I'm not really that bullish on Tom Brady this year from a fantasy perspective. Maybe that comes back to bite me because it's Tom Brady. But I just think that there's a lot of intrigue with lower end QB1s right now outside of him that aren't just pure pocket passers.
Yeah, he threw the ball 719 times last year. You want to guess where that ranks all time?
It was Stafford 727 was first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who's second?
Yeah.
And how old is he? He's turning 45 in a few days.
Yeah, like is his arm going to be stable? Like is he like it's crazy, right? Like it's a very hard thing to buy into. And it's a lot easier to buy into if he had the exact same weapons as last year, right? But the weapons Russell Gage is fine. Like Russell Gage is not a bad wide receiver. It's just he's not Antonio Brown, and Chris Godwin's not healthy, and Rob Gronkowski is not there. It's like, what is this really going to look like for him?
Scott, I know you guys had your consensus rankings come out. Looking at Tom Brady, was he tough for you to rank? What was your thoughts about where you ranked him this year?
No, I like him. I was just looking at a fantasy calculator ADP, and I don't know how much to trust that, but he's their QB 12, and like it's Tom Brady with the Bucs and this offense.
I'm actually higher. Yeah, I'm higher than that on him. I've met 11, so I'm higher than ADP there. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I like Russell Gage a lot. I liked him a lot more when he was like wide receiver, like 50 by ADP. He keeps jumping. He sustained 3 fantasy wide receiver ones by fantasy points per game last year. Something interesting is like, I really think Rob Gronkowski might be the most valuable offensive player, non-quarterback of all time. And if you look at Tom Brady's splits with and without Rob Gronkowski, I've tweeted it out a number of times. It's like legitimately insane where like the team scores 5 fewer points. He takes 37% more sacks. His yards per attempt drops by. His like passer rating falls from like top 5 in any given season to like Ben Roethlisberger last year levels. It's like really maybe not that bad, but it's pretty crazy. But yeah, I like Evans. He's going to score a shit ton of touchdowns. I still like Gage at ADP. I don't like Brady. Leonard Fournette, I really love. He was getting Christian McCaffrey's workload at the tail end of last season. That was crazy. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts. And Godwin's fine for like a tournament style league where, you really want those points in the bonus rounds.
So based off of those splits, we were thinking there's a chance we see a remake of that video where they were like in the Park District or whatever, and Tom Brady had a conch and Gronk came out of the woods there. So that's something we might have.
There's a really good. I'm still drafting him. I just took him in a league.
Yeah.
There's a really good chance. He just missed me with that practice shit. I'm gonna party in Miami and call me in week 7.
It's like the guys playing college soccer. There was always like a group of guys that were like very good, always hurt in preseason, but come regular season they were good to go. They didn't want to go through the camp. But Rams, another team mentioned, obviously won the Super Bowl. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe you said on the podcast 80% of the Rams touchdowns came from passes in 2021. So there's the potential for regression in the passing game. Some people are getting pretty excited about Allen Robinson. Some people are a bit hesitant, due to the last season. Maybe some people got burned. But just based off of that regression, Mark, you talked about, JJ, are people being too optimistic about Allen Robinson?
So here's the thing, the Rams have that crazy split last year. A lot of it was driven by Matthew Stafford throwing the ball a ton at the goal line. He probably still will throw a decent bit at the goal line, but it's likely not going to be like the exact same as what we saw last year. And the way they score touchdowns, when teams score that many touchdowns, you usually see like a 13-ish% drop where they're at year over year, which is a significant number of touchdowns that you're going to see go to the rushing department as opposed to passing. The thing with Allen Robinson, though, is that I'm still into him, regardless of this like regression that's coming. I know that Robinson's there's a split for sure within the fantasy space of people who just think he's done, like this could be it for him. He's going the Des Bryant route. But to me, there's enough evidence last year that the Bears just really were just didn't care about A-Rob. If you look at his like PFF grade and stuff, it's really not that much different than some other like Marquise Brown and Jerry Jeudy and guys that are going in that range to begin with in drafts. And so, I don't think he's like totally dust, but at the same time, you have to just kind of roll that dice when you're in the 4th and 5th round anyway. These are where league winning wide receivers come from often. And I really think that in this LA offense, if you look at the Sean McVay era, because they run so much 11 personnel, the lowest wide receiver target share from a team standpoint that they had has been 63%. And that would have been top 10 in 2021. So basically they throw to their wide receivers all the time. As we know, over the last 4 years, the Rams have had at least 2 wide receivers at a prorated target share per game of 21% or higher. So if A-Rob is healthy the entire season, chances are he's going to hit that 20%, 21% range. And in that offense, given the way they operated last year, he could walk into, if he's healthy again, if he could walk into 130 targets. And so, given that offense, given that system, I'm buying from a redraft perspective because I think people generally overstate their ability to hit players in that range of the draft, especially if he goes into round 5. I mean, it's just a block city for me, but like, I think people overstate, what busts are in those rounds and what that can do to your fantasy squad. It's really not that big of a deal if a guy does completely bust, as long as you are not just throwing him into your fantasy lineup week in and week out like people were doing with Allen Robinson last year after getting him in round 3. So, I'm into Robinson at ADP and just got to hope that last year was just more of a blip as opposed to the start of a trend.
And the Ravens also mentioned on the podcast. I want to turn to Scott on this one because I know the Ravens offense a bit different than last year. I think there was only 12 games of Lamar Jackson. Now there's no Hollywood Brown. We're hoping JK's healthy, but it's another team that's very different than it was last year, and kind of draws the question with Mark Andrews. He was the tight end 1. Are people too optimistic about Mark Andrews? Because I feel like you have a bold opinion here on him.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm fading Mark Andrews. This is like one of my favorite players in all of football. I have him on a million dynasty leagues, like really love him. But over the last 3 seasons, he's finished 5th, 4th, and then last year 1st in fantasy points per game. That was a 43% jump in fantasy points per game from last year to the year before. And so you have to ask, like, what was the catalyst behind that? He was just as efficient as he's always been, actually like below his career average, but still like really high. It was only his 3rd best season by targets per route run. Route percentage was basically the same. The main catalyst then was a massive increase in routes run per game. It was 23.3 to 38.9. That's a 67% increase. And I just think there's no way that's sustainable. The Baltimore Ravens have finished first, and then last year 19th in point differential. And then they lost their RB1, RB2, and RB3 to season-ending injuries in training camp. So you just kind of had no force but to lean atypically pass-heavy. And like clearly the results weren't great. He finished below 500 for the first time since 2015. I just think like Lamar Jackson is sort of one of those quarterbacks where the more he passes, the less you feel really good about your team's chance of winning. And I think they just go back to sort of that bully ball that they've always ran with hopefully a healthier J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, Tyler Batty, Mike Davis. And so I see a massive regression for Mark Andrews and just about everyone except for maybe Lamar Jackson. Like I said, maybe it's just one of those things where the fewer dropbacks he has, the higher his fantasy points per dropback. And like quarterback, unlike the other positions, is one driven by efficiency and not volume for the most part. And I guess Rashad Bateman's probably a value. You like him, right, JJ?
I do, yeah. And I agree with everything you said. With regard to Andrews, you have to keep in mind that like that's a huge opportunity cost to get Mark Andrews in the second round. Like you're passing up on some really good running backs and wide receivers. And Baltimore last year, you mentioned the routes run number. They ran so many plays. Like they ran an obscene amount of plays, which was really, I mean, they've always run a little bit above average in terms of plays with Greg Roman and with this offense with Lamar Jackson. But it was like 5 more per game than what they typically had seen. And we usually see that regress year over year. And just to give you some perspective on how many plays they ranked 23rd last year in pass rate, but they were 9th in total pass attempts because they were just running so many plays. So they were still a fairly run heavy team. And that was with, injuries to the defense, with no running backs. I mean, with literally everything came together for Baltimore last year to be probably as pass heavy as we might ever see them with Lamar Jackson and Greg Roman together. Right. And so, to me, that's just the sign that they're almost definitely going to probably finish the season once again with more rush attempts than pass attempts, which is what they didn't do last year. But I do think a guy like Bateman, where he's going, he's someone who can at least capture a pretty large target share to offset that. I wouldn't be shocked if Rashad Bateman has like a sort of like a Darnell Mooney type situation in season like he had last year, where he's seeing 28% of the team's targets. The difference is that, he's getting them from Lamar Jackson as opposed to Darnell Mooney getting them from Andy Dalton and Justin Fields. So hopefully the quality of targets are going to be better for a guy like Bateman. So I'm still high on Bateman. His ADP might rise a little bit, but there's just a lot of good wide receivers sort of in that range. So it might not rise nearly as much, even with hype over the next couple of months. So I think Bateman can capture a pretty large target share, but Andrews just given that opportunity cost. And, I like a lot of late round tight ends this year. I like throwing darts at them. And going with those types of builds, I'm cool, or just going with like a Pitts or something. But I would much rather just like get Kelsey a little bit earlier than Andrews, or just wait on Pitts if I'm going to go with an early round tight end approach than going with Mark Andrews.
You're a Pitts guy?
Yeah, I like Pitts. I do.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Graham keeps fighting me on it, but
no, man, he's gonna the volume there is just. I mean, regardless of the situation, he's just gonna gobble up targets there.
Here's my take. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I think I'd say you, me, and Mike Clay, if I could put myself on the list, are like the best like X's and O's regression guys. But there's something to be said about when you're a slave to regression, to the mean, and all that stuff. Like you're right 90% of the time. You're definitely directionally right. But like the players who really swing leagues are the true outliers. And so like Jonathan Taylor, every single beat writer was like, yeah, he's not going to get anything more than 55% of the snaps and like 65% of the rushes. If you're lucky, they just love Nyheim Hines and all this stuff. Or Jamar Chase, he's like a rookie wide receiver who took a year off, but my model said he was the greatest wide receiver, the only perfect prospect I've ever seen. Yeah. Christian McCaffrey, and same thing. You can always just look at those guys and you're like, oh, there's no way this is sustainable. This is going to regress to the mean. Jamar Chase's fantasy points per deep target last year, all that stuff. But like there are outliers, and this is a game driven by outliers who really just swing leagues and are head and shoulders above everyone else. And to me, that's Kyle Pitts. I don't know that it comes next year, but I know it comes. And so like I like betting on those. It's just a matter of when, not if. That's my take on it. But maybe you have a better analytical argument.
The way I see it is you should be drafting good players, especially a wide receiver and tight end and such. Like I know it's so simple, but like, and I'm the last person that says just draft the right player and you'll be fine. Strategy is the backbone of everything that I do. But from the standpoint of like player eval and player analysis, you should be striving for elite players themselves, right? And I think ADP then fluctuates a lot based on situation. And the only reason why Kyle Pitts is not like a late second rounder in a lot of these drafts is because of situation. Otherwise he would be. So if you're leaning in on two things, one, we generally overstate situation in terms of what we know, what we can predict. There's teams that we get wrong every single year, and it's all reflected in ADP. This is why there's been great studies done where if you stack in season long, It's not so much that you're getting that like high variance spiked week in that given week. It's that if you're stacking and that quarterback ends up hitting, that means the rest of the offense is hitting. So you're getting a lot of value across your team, right? And all that's driven by is our evaluation of what that offense just generally is going to look like entering a season. And so the way that I view Kyle Pitts is, number one, he's going to walk into probably the second best target, maybe the third best target share, at tight end this season. And it's very
and maybe the best route share.
Yeah, right.
Running wide receiver routes.
Exactly. But the assumption right now is that everyone just assumes that Atlanta, and understandably so, I'm not saying that it's not going to be the case, but everyone assumes that Atlanta is going to throw 16 passing touchdowns this year. So, if that is 25, if something goes right, or if like some of the pass to rush touchdown ratio stuff that I look at, if that ends up going in the passing department more than expected, then all of a sudden Kyle Pitts is a 8 touchdown guy and, seeing all this volume and has the stability and the spiked weeks, and he's a godly talent. I mean, like, why not just go after that at that point in the draft?
I like that bus meme where it's like one guy who's like, Kyle Pitts is 1.37 inline yard per route run, regresses and then there's the other guy who's like, you got a dog in him. And it's like, you in fantasy football, you really do. You have to be down the middle. Like John last year, I was like, I don't know that I can get on board with Jonathan Taylor in the first, maybe at the turn. And he's just like, he's a freak. And it's like, yeah, that's right.
Right.
So you need to blend those.
Yeah.
All right. I do want to shift over to the ambiguous wide receiver episode. I thought this specific situation I wanted to ask about, because you mentioned middle round true breakouts, likely not having another wide receiver on the same team also going in the middle round, based off your study there. So I wanted to ask, does that apply to the Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton situation? Obviously, now with Russell Wilson, with both of them going what seems like pretty close to each other in drafts, and wanted to see your thoughts on that, if it applies to them or if you are leaning to one of those guys more than the other for having a big season.
Yeah. So, I've looked at like what I call ambiguous backfields and ambiguous wide receiver cores and stuff, just a bit. And all it basically is, if you're drafting a middle round wide receiver, which I've defined, or running back, which I've defined as round 6 to 9. So pick 60 to 18 or 108 in a typical redraft league. Which, Jeudy and Sutton don't fall in that category. So I haven't analyzed them in particular. So they're not necessarily part of the quote ambiguous, wide receiving group. But yeah, I mean, I found running backs in particular, if you have like a very standard handcuff that's going in the middle rounds, we don't see it as much these days as we used to when like Ben Tate was drafted in round 8 every year, when Arian Foster was a first round pick and stuff. But those guys have literally never exceeded expectation by 3+ points per game in a season, across an entire season. You're going to see spiked weeks from them, sure, when there are injuries and stuff, whatever, but we just don't see those RB2s pan out ever. There's a little bit of a better case for the wide receiver 2s when they have wide receiver 1s drafted early, but it's still not like sensational. And, it's the only reason and the only thing that's like scares me off of like Devontae Smith a little bit, or like Adam Thielen a little bit. Like, objectively, I look at them and I'm like, man, they're good pick. Like, they're not bad picks at all here. But historically, ADP trends have not favored those kinds of wide receivers who are wide receiver 2s on their team by ADP and have an elite wide receiver on their team that are going early. And so, there are other things that trump that, like for Devontae Smith in particular, like second year middle round wide receivers just slay. I mean, they crush, and we're going to have a ton of them this year. And you should be targeting those guys in the middle rounds because they have insane hit rates. But, when it comes to the Broncos and this wide receiving group, I'm leaning Cortland Sutton over Jeudy right now, mostly because, I like Jerry Jeudy coming out. I think my model had him as the wide receiver 1 in that class, even like ahead of CeeDee Lamb. So, I liked Jeudy coming out plenty. It's just one of those situations where we've seen Sutton ball out before. Like we've seen it. Whereas we just haven't gotten there yet with Jeudy. And I do enough drafts where I'm going to have both and have exposure to both, but I'm throwing darts to this entire Broncos team right now. I mean, I love KJ Hamler. I've gotten so much of in the late rounds. Tim Patrick, even before the spike that we've seen a little bit over the last like few weeks, I've been drafting Tim Patrick. There's been talk from like Cecil Lammey out of the Broncos world saying that Tim Patrick is a better bet to just be better than Jerry Jeudy this year, which is bold and strong, but just another reason why it's a little bit safer and easier to go more that Cortland Sutton route. But from the standpoint of the ambiguous wide receiver stuff, they don't really fit that mold just because they're going more in round 4.
I just wanted to say Cecil has a tremendous hit rate when he says something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I've been, it's scarier. It's scary just given that, like, you can take what beat writers say with a grain of salt, obviously, but at the same time, like, it's not nothing. It's not like he's just saying things to say things. And it's a scary thought that like people are drafting Jerry Jeudy, and there's been a little bit more of a separation between Jeudy and Sutton recently, but they're still very close in ADP. And the fact that we have that statement and the fact that we've already seen Sutton ball out before with bad quarterback play, and Jeudy did what he did last year when he came back. I know Sutton was really bad too last year, but there's just enough reason for me to just play it safer, because I think that both of them have reasonably the same upside, like if things click and hit for them. So it's not like, I'd be favoring a player who has a better floor and not as good of a ceiling. I think they both have a good ceiling in the offense.
Just a real quick background on Jeudy. My go-to PFF film experts who watch every single play of every single game. Judy's first year, they said this is one of the best wide receivers in football. He is getting open at will. Mm-hmm. He is an absolute freak. And he said last year he did not look good at all. And so there's a question, maybe it's that lingering ankle injury, or maybe we all just overstated his ability. But yeah, it wouldn't shock me if, much to my and everyone else's chagrin, Tim Patrick and KJ Hamler were the guys.
Yeah, it's just so interesting looking at where they're going on. I mean, it's going to be a little bit different site to site, but what I'm looking at, 27, wide receiver 27 for Sutton and 29 for Jeudy. So it's literally a hair away. And obviously a lot of people want to say it's going to be this guy or that guy, when in reality it's just going to be a good offense. We're at least hoping for. But same episode, you also mentioned a good hit rate for wide receiver 2s in systems where they're going late in drafts and their wide receiver 1 is going early. And I wanted to see if anybody stands out to you as somebody that kind of fits that mold that you might be looking at in drafts.
Yeah, so it's kind of counterintuitive whenever I looked at the data. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Why do middle round wide receiver 2s, so team wide receiver 2s with team wide receiver 1s that are going early, why do they not hit very well? But once you get to the late rounds, the double digit rounds, those team wide receiver 2s that have early round wide receiver 1s, why do they hit so well? And what I realized was it's all age related. It's all related to them being these younger, inexperienced, we don't know, these ambiguous wide receiver. Think Justin Jefferson his rookie year, right? He was the wide receiver 2 with Adam Thielen as an early round pick. And, we thought that Justin Jefferson could be good, sure. But he was going later in drafts and hitting that 10th round ish in drafts. And he ended up breaking out and coming through. And we've seen that Alshon Jeffrey back when he was a year 2 guy with Brandon Marshall in Chicago. We saw him break out. And really it just comes down to these guys that are going later, who the reason that they're going later is because they're inexperienced and we don't have that much information on them. And I've really realized through doing all of these studies that that's one of the biggest edges that you can find. Even when trying to beat the running back dead zone, you should be finding young players that are in the dead, rookies in the running back dead zone actually have insanely good hit rates. If you can find Breece Hall right now in the running back dead zone, he's not a bad bet, just because the reason he's in the dead zone is not so much situation per se or anything like that. It's not talent per se. It's situation, right? Whereas if he had a situation where he was with what Najee Harris had last year, Breece Hall would be a second round pick. So draft on talent, and that's basically what this data is saying: is draft on talent. Get these young guys who have shown something. That were drafted highly. A lot of them had good draft capital as well, that have those early round wide receivers with them. One guy that sort of works for this, there's not many this year, I would say, but one guy it sort of works for is Jahan Dotson this year. You got Terry McLaurin going a little bit early. Maybe he doesn't get to the 3rd round, so maybe this doesn't necessarily fully apply. But Jahan Dotson, the wide receiver 2 by ADP, and the reason why he's not going any higher is because we just don't know totally what's going down in Washington. It's more situation based than talent based, because he was a 16th overall pick. And a guy that I didn't really invest in at all from a dynasty standpoint, my model didn't like him. He was an athletic freak, a wide receiver, but his production wasn't quite there, was Alec Pierce. But he's just another guy who, again, he's the wide receiver 2 by ADP right now. Paris Campbell's kind of inching up, but he's the wide receiver 2 by ADP behind that stud. He has that opportunity, but people are just a little bit skittish with him and scared off by him because we just don't know. So look for guys that we just don't have this full story on, and that's the reason why their ADP is where it's at, as opposed to these like random veterans that have been in the league for 6 or 7 years that are going the double-digit rounds. Those wide receivers are not worth it. They very, very, very rarely hit.
Scott, does somebody else stand out to you that kind of fits that mold? Maybe somebody that wasn't mentioned.
Yeah, I'll just agree with Jahan Dotson. I wrote him up last week. He's one of my favorite targets, one of the most mispriced wide receivers in all of drafts, I think. Alec Pierce is the same thing for me, JJ. My model hated him, loved the athleticism, but everything else was riddled with red flags. I watched the tape, and he really wowed me. I thought he was incredible on tape. But the GM, when he drafted him, said, well, he has some things to work on. His route running needs a little polished, could be more nuanced, all that stuff. But when Washington drafted Jahan Dotson, they said, no, we drafted him so he would play right away. We love that he's NFL ready today, and he's going to be our starting outside wide receiver who can also move into the slot to get manufactured touches. And he's QB proof. His QB, and he basically, Ron Rivera almost literally said, listen, I don't want to knock the guy, but he's ass. And Jahan was awesome. So, Carson Wentz, not the most accurate quarterback, but Jahan Dotson made it work with far worse quarterback play. And he's been the star of camp, just like Elijah Moore was last year. So, headed in the positive direction.
The Jahan Dotson stuff, because it's been in Dynasty too. Like people have been taking like David Bell over. Like I like David Bell, fine. It's just like it's been very strange because it seems like the pure reason and the single reason why Jahan Dotson in Superflex leagues is like at times been like a mid-second round rookie pick is strictly because he's not an early declare wide receiver. Like that's what it comes down to for people. But there's still so much good to him. He's not like this. Like if you look at the early declare busts or the non-early declare busts that we've seen in the first round, which is many, over the last like decade, a lot of them just didn't have the same profile and production profile that Jahan Dotson had. He was a very, very good wide receiver, and I think he's going to make an impact in redraft right now. He's also one of those guys where, I did a study on rookie wide receivers and how valuable they are in redraft, and he's one of those guys that's likely going to be in that pick 100 to 150 range where the first half of the season, their hit rates are pretty average, but if you look at only their second half average points per game, their hit rates are out of control. Like we saw it with Amon-Ra St. Brown last year and stuff, but we see that with rookie wide receivers every single season, and Jahan Dotson definitely fits that mold. So I'm in total agreement that he's a huge value in all formats right now.
Yeah. So I'm seeing the same thing. I'm seeing what I'll call hubris, intellectual hubris, when it comes to how redraft players are ranking these rookie wide receivers, thinking that they know more than NFL teams. And I think a great, like you said, there's the early declare thing, but I think that's super overblown, and you have to look at it on a case by case basis. Like it's super important. Like the track record in that is like hard to deny, but really all it's saying is like, be wary of older wide receivers who only have one good year. Right. But you have to look at Devonta Smith and Chris Olave, who both had high round 2 grades, and they just chose to stay in school because they wanted to compete for the championship. They wanted a round 1 grade. Travis Etienne, it was the same thing. And Jahan Dotson, like all these wide receivers, it was like a weird COVID year where like they didn't get to play as many games as they wanted. It was a shortened season. But yeah, back to like the hubris I'm seeing, like Sky Moore, like my model didn't love Sky Moore, though a lot of people did, but he's being drafted as the rookie wide receiver 3. He was the wide receiver 13 in the NFL draft, and Kansas City could have taken him. They traded down, and like 5 wide receivers went off the board, and then they took him. And so it's just like, why is he going so far above Jahan Dotson? Why is Wan'Dale Robinson going 4 rounds later than any rookie wide receiver who went above him? Yeah. And it's just, I don't know. Typically, as we know, like draft capital is the most predictive variable you can have. And so, again, Jahan Dotson's awesome.
Yeah.
Just to wrap that up.
It does relate to a degree to your rookie wide receiver episode, where you did talk about the hit rates of different guys. And one of the hit rates you mentioned was guys that went in the top 100, exceeding expectations, but fantasy managers undervaluing them in redraft, which kind of draws the question for someone who might be listening right now and saying, you know, I kind of struggle to understand when to take rookies in my redraft and when to feel comfortable reaching for certain guys. What would you suggest to somebody that kind of has that iffiness to their draft, saying, you know, I don't want to overreach and be, you know, rookie feverish here, but also I've seen, you know, the likes of the Jamar Chase and Justin Jeffersons of the world, which are more of asterisks. But what's your thoughts there? I know you talked a lot about that in your rookie wide receiver episode.
Yeah. So basically, if you look at top 100 picks in redraft leagues that are rookie wide receivers, you know, you're talking like the best of the best, because this is redraft, right? Like, we're not talking startup drafts. We're talking redraft. So like you're talking like first round picks, and oftentimes it's like the top 10 picks, like the Mike Evans, the Jamar Chases, all of that. And so, you know, you got Drake London this year as he's a lock to go in like a casual home league, whatever. To go in the top 100. You know, I think that, you know, Treylon Burks is slipping, and, you know, we can't lock in anyone else, but Drake London is someone that we can probably confidently lock in as a top 100 pick. And basically the way that I work all these like breakout studies and stuff like that is I look at historical ADP and I chart historical ADP by points per game. And then I find a trend line that basically tells you expected points per game at ADP, right? So if a guy is drafted 60th overall, he has some sort of expectation from a points per game standpoint. And if you look at top 100 rookie wide receivers over the last decade, there's been like 15 to 20 of them. There hasn't been a ton, but there's been a decent amount of them. They exceeded expectation at like an 80% rate, just exceeded expectation. And then I call guys who exceed by 3 points, moderate breakouts, and by 6 or more points, true breakouts. And both of those rates, the moderate and true breakout rate, are exceedingly better than the typical sample of top 100 wide receivers. So based on that, and those are season-long numbers, right? The other thing to keep in mind is that rookie wide receivers do a lot better the second half of the season than they do the front half of the season. So if you only look at the second half numbers, those numbers get even better. So, and not only that, but that's when we play fantasy championships and we're in the fantasy playoffs where we need that production even more. So definitely like wherever Drake London is going and your whatever ADP you're using or whatever platform you're on, bump him up like 5 or 10 spots. And that's where he probably should be drafted based on historical ADP. And we should feel confident in that. I mean, he was a unbelievable prospect, ended up getting confirmed by, you know, all of our pre-draft like question marks that we might've had. He goes 8th overall. So you can feel good about that. And he's walking onto a team that has 0 wide receiver competition. He can see he can realistically hit a 25% target share this year, and none of us would flinch. I mean, that's what the competition looks like for London. And so, you know, he's someone who I'm targeting heavily. And then the other thing that was really interesting is what I mentioned earlier with the guys that go pick 100 to 150, which is usually like day 2 guys, you know, round 2 wide receivers and stuff. But in redraft. So those players traditionally get off to pretty slow starts because, you know, like an Alec Pierce is a good example of that, where like, you know, we don't know exactly, you know, he might not have a role right away, but, you know, the Colts might say, oh, Paris Campbell, you suck. We're going to throw Alec Pierce out on the field. Maybe they signed Julio Jones and he got hurt or something like that. And so, you know, they'll throw those guys on the field and give them more opportunities as the season goes on. Those players that like pick 100 to 150 players, the difference between front half and back half numbers is like obscene historically. Like you're going to see a massive, massive jump with those guys. Whether that means you want to draft them or not, you know, maybe you want to trade for them, maybe you want to add them off the waiver wire. Like we saw that with Chase Claypool and T Higgins historically, you know, as examples, but don't ignore rookie wide receivers. Like I remember like back in the day, there would be analysts saying like, don't draft rookie wide receivers. They don't do anything their rookie year. It's not that at all. It hasn't been that. That's the thing. It hasn't even like necessarily changed just in the last few years. It's really been a trend that you should be targeting these rookie wide receivers, especially because of what they do the second half of the season.
So hearing that, Scott, what would be your strategy? Would you draft guys and stash them on your benches? Obviously in redraft, we don't always have the shortest of the longest of benches, or would you say just duke it out later on the waiver wire?
I mean, it depends on the player. But yeah, I just wanted to echo one point. It's also like the talent that we get doesn't come in at like a perfectly even rate. We had like one of the worst stretches for wide receiver talents.
Yeah.
There were 28 wide receivers drafted in round 1 since 2015. Only 4 have made the Pro Bowl of those 28. Amari Cooper, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, and CeeDee Lamb. So the last 2 years were good with Jefferson, Lamb, and Chase, but for a long time it was just Cooper and like the Kevin Whites, Brashad Perrimans of the world were all mega busts. But yeah, this is what I'm seeing. This is what my model is showing. Is like last year was an insane wide receiver class. The year before that, really good. This year was really solid. So, yeah, and we see that with draft capital too. Like so many, part of that's due to the contracts. But I think there are a lot of exciting wide receivers, rookie wide receivers to gamble on. Like even like I just drafted Justin Ross in a tournament style FFPC league. I just like YOLO because like he's one of my guys, but like you'll know right away whether he's going to be a thing. Like it's just like, hey, is he getting meaningful snaps in week 1? No, you could drop him at a cost of nothing. So, but the upside's there, and that's usually what I do. I like to load up on cheap wide receivers late in the draft, particularly rookie wide receivers. In my best ball guide last year, I said Wes Huber thinks Amon-Ra St. Brown is a superstar. I think Elijah Moore is going to be one of the best picks you can make, and they're going undrafted in 90% of best ball leagues. That was before the NFL draft. And Amon-Ra's price barely budged. So, a lot of value to be had there. And he was, the league winner of all league winners last year.
And I did want to ask one more question about a recent episode, because I think there's a difference between how you guys see this specific topic, which should be interesting, but ambiguous running backs. So we talked a lot about wide receivers right there. JJ, I know you're a fan of targeting running backs in ambiguous backfields. Scott, I think you might be the opposite way. So I kind of want to ask you guys your thoughts on that, and somebody, JJ, who kind of fits that mold of what you're talking about on that episode.
Yeah, so really, again, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where I was analyzing round 6 to 9 guys. So middle round is what I dub middle round. And then I also looked at late round guys as well. But basically just looked at ADP trends. And what I found was, the guys who broke out, who are moderate breakouts, like I said, or true breakouts, whichever way you want to look at it, those guys, the average ADP of the RB1s on their team was like pick 62 overall. And so what that tells you is that a lot of these guys are either the RB1s on their team that are being drafted in the middle rounds, or from an ADP standpoint, or they don't have a running back going on their team that's being drafted very early. And like I said earlier on the show, we don't see a ton of them anymore, but we don't really see middle round team RB2s with team RB1 teammates going in round 1 and 2. They just don't pan out, which makes sense because they have a stud on their team, right? But what I did find is twofold. So number one, the market's pretty good at knowing which running back is going to emerge from a backfield. So if you have 2 running backs from the same backfield in the middle rounds, last year, Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones is a good example. The ADP sources, it's going to fluctuate. Like this is just like a general trend based on the ADP source that I'm using, but the RB1s from those backfields are hitting at a much, much more substantial rate than the RB2s are. So, last year you had Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones. The source that I'm using had Fournette as the RB1 there by a couple rounds. And then, the one that people would say is like, oh, what about James Conner? So James Conner obviously broke out in a big way with Chase Edmonds going ahead of him. But Edmonds technically, again, according to the source, was a dead zone running back. He was going in round 5. So he wasn't quite, he got bumped up to round 5. So he wasn't quite in that middle round territory. But to that point, if you can also find a team RB2 who has a teammate that's going in the dead zone, those guys also pan out at a very, very high rate in terms of ceiling. And the reason for this, there's a lot of logic to this, I think. The reason why that's the case is because think about it this way. If you have 2 running backs going in the single digit rounds from one team, that likely tells you that the backfield is a juicy backfield in some way, right? But if the RB2 is, if the RB2 has an RB1 teammate that's going in round 4 or round 5, but he's still going in round 7 or 8 or something like that, then that RB2 teammate is probably pretty good. And then if we think about the dead zone and why the dead zone exists, it's largely because people are forcing their running back selections in that area of the draft, and they're taking inferior running backs that aren't very talented just forcing it because they want volume, right? Or I should say they want perceived volume. It's not really, it's like the Mike Davis situation last year where they think that he's going to see a lot of work, but he's not talented enough. He's not good enough. And they force their ADP up. And so what happens is we see situations where, like Jordan Howard, when Tariq Cohen had his breakout year, Tariq Cohen had a good year the previous season, but he, hadn't fully broken out, but he was a good pass catcher and he had a role. And Jordan Howard didn't have that role in terms of pass catching. And so Tariq Cohen was able to step in and do something. Another example is Austin Eckler when Melvin Gordon was suspended to start that season, and Eckler carved out a role and was able to sustain that role. And so those RB2s are actually really, really valuable in terms of ceiling because you have this situation where they can have some sort of role. But if the RB1 gets hurt for some period of time, which was the case for a lot of the guys who did break out, in Austin Eckler's case, it was a holdout from, I meant to say suspension, but holdout for Melvin Gordon. If there is an injury, then obviously they have some sort of ceiling. And so from that, that's one of the reasons why I think this could be finally Tony Pollard's season, because it really fits that mold entirely and completely. And I was someone who was not against like Zeke and I'm still not like totally against it, but I do think that historical ADP, if you're looking at that, if you're looking at what you target in the middle rounds, which is a pass catching back, up to year 5 running back, you don't really want to get any older than that. A guy who has an RB1 going in the dead zone, obviously a decent offense. Like this could really be it for Tony Pollard, just based on what we've seen historically. So that's really what that data was all about. I'm still very much a start your, if you are going to try to, if your goal is to get an elite running back in fantasy football, you got to spend up to get an elite running back. It's just the way that we've seen historically. It's just very difficult to get sustainable production at running back, elite sustainable production late. But if you're drafting the middle rounds, target RB1s, or if you're going to get an RB2, get an RB1 or an RB2 as an RB1 going in that dead zone range.
So I didn't want to debate you, JJ, but then you brought up Tony Pollard. So I think I will. I think Tony Pollard's like a huge fade for me at ADP because Ezekiel Elliott played through a torn PCL for 75% of the season, and Pollard still couldn't get a dozen touches per game. They have all this money devoted to Zeke. So I feel like if it didn't happen last year, it's probably never going to happen. People like point at Zeke's declining efficiency, and it's like, okay, it hasn't been great, but he also missed Dak Prescott for 66% of the 2020 season. And then last year, the injury, and then, just take those two things out. And he's just been the monster. He's always been. I don't want to like say this is wrong, because I don't think it's wrong, but it's like a stylistic difference where I'm willing to pay that premium for running backs drafted in the first 2 rounds. You look at the hit rate, it's incredible. It's better than any of the other position. And like when it hits far more than any other position can hit. So it's like, that's where the players with the highest ceiling, the highest median projection, the highest floor, the most predictability, week to week consistency, that's where those players live. So I'm fine paying that premium on the running backs and then just like avoiding the uncertainty, because I think a key component to it is like those running backs who are there, like what is the most likely outcome? I think it's probably a gross running back by committee situation where one running back's getting 60%, the other is getting 40%. But even if it's like 70-30, that's still typically not great. I think people overvalue how valuable an RB15 and RB18 finishes. Like to me, that's like borderline worthless. I want those highest end RB1s that swing leagues. So my question to you, JJ, would be like, one, how are you defining a hit? And then 2, it's like, let's say it is a hit, and like, let's say the hit rate is 50% and it's like a really, really good hit. It's like, drafting 2 ambiguous backfield running backs in like the round 8 and 9, and one of them hits, does that beat out like a round 3 running back? Those are my questions. Yeah.
So I don't want to be misunderstood here. I don't go into drafts saying I'm only I draft running backs in the first 2 rounds. Like that's what I'm saying. I don't really actually disagree with you at all. Like all of my research and my guide and in general says to draft running backs in the first 2 rounds because of exactly what you're saying. Right. Like the work that I've done
on your RB disciple.
Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah, I think anchor RB in a lot of formats or hero RB, whatever you want to call it, is very, very viable because it depending on format, just because
outside of best ball, because I think that's optimal in best ball. But
no, it's great in best ball. I think outside of best ball, if you're in like a full PPR, start 3 wide out in a flex type of format.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, I mean, like I approach like a ton of drafts that way in redraft. The ambiguous backfield stuff is more so like we're still drafting running backs outside the first 2 rounds. Like if we start RB or get a running back in the first round, me approaching the ambiguous wide or ambiguous backfield stuff and trying to find, it's all based on finding running back breakouts. It's not that I go into a draft and say,
that's your strategy.
I'm not getting running backs until the middle rounds, right? It's that I know that I'm going to get an RB3 at some point or an RB4 or even an RB2. And so, yeah, I mean, like the data that I'm looking at is it's saying the same thing. Like, the running back dead zone, round 4 running backs generally from a ceiling standpoint are the same as like a round 7 running back historically. Right. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking the first 2.5 rounds before the dead zone really starts, those running backs that's the way that you get elite production at the position, period. Like it's very, very difficult to get it outside of that. The Tony Pollard stuff though, I don't disagree. Like I talked about Zeke from that perspective. I still talk about him from that perspective on my podcast all the time. My thing with it is he still is a year older than he was last year. He's still moving forward on that age curve. And at the very least, the way that with like Pollard is still going to get some production. He's not going to get, because I agree with you. Like you generally want a top 13, 14-ish running back as your RB2, or else it doesn't really matter that much. But you all at the same time, if you go with more of like an anchor RB approach, you still from a point scoring standpoint, you're going to need to fill that RB2 spot. And if you can get flex production from that RB2 spot while owning other positions and destroying those other positions, that's still viable enough. But then at the same time, you still have the upside then with Tony Pollard of what I talked about earlier with like the Eckler example and stuff like that of if Zeke misses time, because, last year he did have that injury, but he like refused to leave the field. So like we've seen Pollard when Zeke does miss time, like at least show off that ceiling, right? Like we've at least seen that. And I should also preface, I haven't been a Pollard guy. This is the first year that I'm like jumping on the Pollard train because a lot of it is driven by these ADP historical trends. And a lot of people say, oh, it's just ADP historical trends. It's not that big of a deal, but the market repeats itself all the time. Like studying the market is so ungodly important in this stuff because people behave the exact same way year over year in fantasy football. So that really boils down my running back approach and draft strategy. I'm 100%. I don't want to be misunderstood. Like I am not only drafting running backs from ambiguous backfields. I'm just saying that if you're getting a middle round running back or a late round running back, you should be targeting ones that are in these like very ambiguous situations. Like I used the example earlier this week where a lot of people were out on Twitter this week and they're like, I'm not drafting Chase Edmonds because that backfield is so muddied. It's like, yeah, well, it's all reflected in price. Like you're not drafting Chase Edmonds at RB20 right now because there are those other running backs and it's driving down his price, right? But historically, a guy like Chase Edmonds, who's a pass catcher, who's the RB1 on his team by ADP, they exceed expectation the most in those backfields. Maybe it's not Chase Edmonds this year, but those kinds of examples are the ones who end up exceeding expectation most.
Yeah, I just want to apologize for strawmanning JJ into a zero RB argument he wasn't making.
Yeah, definitely not. Yeah.
But I'll still fight you on Pollard.
We'll see.
It reminds me of Joseph Randall, who played for the Cowboys. He was DeMarco Murray's backup. He averaged like 7 yards per carry one season. But like time and time again, we see these typically smaller running backs who are hyper efficient on their touches, but like coaches just don't want to give them more touches because they don't think they have the body type or to withstand the bruising nature of the position and like what comes with all those touches. And that's just my vibe. And then also like just Jerry Jones being Jerry Jones and all the money that you have tied to Zeke. So Zeke is a guy I'm drafting and I'm getting so much shit for it. So I just had
I view fantasy football in a very like fluid way. Like, as you know, like I'm a very gray area thinker with this stuff. And I think in terms of probability, so like, I certainly like, I've still drafted Zeke, even though he's like a dead zone back and you don't want to go after the whatever. I still understand it, but at the same time, like I don't want to ignore what has really shown and hit from a high ceiling standpoint in the middle rounds historically. And that is these RB2s associated with these because Tony Pollard is going to have a receiving role in the offense. Like he's going to see a double-digit percentage target share more than likely if he stays healthy. And so he's going to get some production out of that offense. And then if this is finally the year that Zeke wears down or breaks down or gets injured, then that's where the ceiling would come from then with Pollard.
So Zeke actually is like just killing me because I like David Montgomery more, but Montgomery is going a full round later. I love the dead zone running backs. We'll talk about your favorite in 1 second, but I keep drafting Zeke in round 4, hoping Montgomery falls to where his ADP is in round 5. And instead, like, I lose out on Montgomery, and I'm like, fuck, I liked him more than Zeke. Yeah. But your favorite, I believe, is Travis Etienne, who's going in between them.
I do love ETN, man. Again, it goes back to I did a study on what kind of running backs beat the running back dead zone historically, right? I will say this too, like all of this stuff is ADP based, and a lot of the ADP data that I work with is August ADP data. And so like right now we're working with like sharper ADP generally. Like if we're on Underdog or whatever, like people have drafted in May and June are degenerates. Like they're the 1% of fantasy football. But yeah, I mean, like if you look at the running backs that have traditionally beat the dead zone, I mentioned earlier, rookie running backs do a really good job, but second year running backs also do a really good job of doing that. Those are the two best cohorts from an age perspective. But the rookie running backs end up exceeding expectation by 3+ points per game or moderate breakouts at a 29% rate. When the general population in that range is like 16%, like it's pretty low, and that includes rookies. And then the second year guys is like 22% or something like that. And so you want those types of players, you want those younger players. And then on top of that, I found that players who break out, as we know, like targets are very valuable to running backs in fantasy football. They have a large proportion of their touches that go through the air versus on the ground. And that's exactly what we're going to see with ETN's likely not like a more than 160 carry kind of player. He might see a decent bit with James Robinson banged up and such, but we're drafting him for the hope that he sees like a 17 or 18% target share in that offense. And it's in an offense that, could trail, a decent bit, and we'll see some dump offs there. So ETN's a guy that I like. And based on some of that, the historical ADP trends, Breece Hall, I think, is still kind of intriguing. Because I think that he's you want to target these guys that are being pushed down more so by situation and not talent, because you want to be drafting these talented players. And, Breece Hall is a very, very good prospect.
Yeah. So I agree. And with him at 2, it goes back to, rookie wide receivers tend to be more productive in the second half of the rookie season. That's the same thing for running backs. I don't know. I had the stat up somewhere, but it's like a 54% increase in snaps per game and fantasy points per game, all that stuff. Yeah. Graham asked me about Etienne a week ago, and I was like, I just don't have a good read on him. And then I read your piece, and it like really brought me back to him. And it's like, yeah, you said like he maybe he's just a 16 touch guy, but he was a bell cow in college. He's excellent receiver. There's no competition. And it's like, no, I was just too low on him. I thought you made a great case for him.
Yeah, I mean, he was a really good prospect in my model too. Like he was right there with Najee, in terms of prospect score, and Javonte in terms of prospect score. So like he's a good player, like period. And again, if he didn't have the injury that he was coming off of, and if we had seen him even play 2 games in the NFL, like I think he would be easily a 3rd round. I mean, it's usually like he's climbing a little bit, but he could be like realistically in some formats a 2-3 turn guy. Because of the volume that he could see through the air. So I think he's still a value, and he's one of those players where I highly doubt he's going to rise like dramatically in like home leagues and more casual leagues and stuff.
Is it fair to say like what we saw before the injury out of DeAndre Swift on a team that was trailing games and got a ton of passing work, maybe not tons and tons of rushing work? Is that a good kind of mirrored situation of Etienne going into this season, you think?
Yeah, I got a question for my mailbag this week, and then I answered, and it'll be on the mailbag. But it was basically like, this person said that he read a lot of Film People's analysis on Travis Etienne. He knows that I look at try to merge both and look at stuff more subjectively and not just through the lens of my model and stuff like that. And they said that Etienne was someone who they just tried to get the ball in his hands, but wasn't necessarily an elite pass catcher. Which, okay, that's fine. Like if you want to approach it from the standpoint that like Etienne's not Christian McCaffrey out of the backfield from a receiving standpoint, I still think that he has a ceiling that's pretty crazy as a pass catcher. But even if you just accept that as fact, what would we call like Aaron Jones or DeAndre Swift in the way that they score points, in the way that they play out of the backfield? I think that that's the kind of archetype that we're looking at with Travis Etienne. And similar to what we saw out of Detroit last year, them trailing them Detroit ran their offense last year before those injuries through a tight end and a running back, really. I mean, from their passing offense. And we could see something pretty similar in Jacksonville with not a lot of strong and reliable weapons necessarily there. So I think Etienne's a good high floor, high ceiling pick.
Scott, was there anything else as we have JJ on the show that you wanted to make sure you asked him about hour and 36 in right now? What did we miss that you wanted to ask? Unless we've covered the world of fantasy here.
Any other must draft targets for you? Other than that, just thanks for coming on. I think JJ has the best podcast in the space. It's like perfect for everyone in the year 2022, which means you have ADD and short, quick hits, gets to the point. Really respect his analysis. Really a leader in the industry. All of his success is well deserved. Check out he started his own thing, so check out the draft guide and everything else he's doing. And now that I've buttered you up, give our listeners one or two must draft targets.
Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier that I really dig some of the late round tight end builds this year. Like I'm going, like 3 tight end builds and even 4 at times if I go super, super late. A guy that I've targeted a ton that's been pretty accepted throughout the space, I think, as the go-to, like one of the go-to late round tight ends is Cole Kmet. It's a situation where if you look at, if he really should be able to walk into like a 20% target share this season in that offense. And if you look historically at tight ends that have been able to hit that mark, even a prorated mark, as long as they hit 8 games, there's been 67 of them since 2011 and 63 finished with at least double-digit PPR points per game, which doesn't sound like a lot, but at the tight end position, that's basically him already exceeding where he's being drafted right now. Yeah. So I think Kmet is an easy go-to. I mentioned Kadarius Toney. I've gotten a lot of Wandell as well. I'm high in the Giants too, just from like a value standpoint overall. Drafting a lot of the other thing too, I should note is year 2. I mentioned this earlier, year 2 middle round wide receivers. Even if the projection doesn't look phenomenal for like an Amon-Ra St. Brown or an Elijah Moore, because the offenses they're in from a projection standpoint and the weapons that are around them, those types of players dominate in terms of hit rate. They exceed ADP expectation by 3+ points historically at a 41% clip, which is out of control compared to the general population of middle round wide receivers. And there's a lot of them this year. There's a lot of those second year wideouts because that class last year was really strong and people are pushing them up. But even Devontae Smith and Rashad Bateman's another one. So I'm really, really heavy on a lot of those guys.
All right. I know you mentioned before too, like not hiding your secrets as an analyst and just putting it all out there and having that process. So appreciate that in general. But if you guys have not checked out the late round draft guide, it's a must check out. The podcast as well. But JJ, thank you so much for your time, man. I know we kept you for a while, but I think this podcast had tons of good stuff on it. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me.